Good morning. I don't want to begin today before I thank my very gracious and generous hosts. I want to thank the bishops for inviting me and Monsignor Azar for his very kind and generous hospitality. It's a pleasure to be here, especially with so many brothers. It was a special pleasure just now at church to have the liturgy together. I'm usually a lone wolf at the liturgy, and I only do the Maronite liturgy for a small group of, I don't know if this is canonical, but for a small group of Syriac Orthodox families around Notre Dame. They've settled in the area and have small businesses, and they like the liturgy all in Syriac, of course, because they speak it, they chatter it, it's wonderful. But to hear it in English is a whole special treat, really. The translation moves so nicely. That's the first thing I was aware of, because during the week I usually do liturgy in the Latin, right? You know, the Romans adopted English at Vatican II, but these days that's hard to tell. But our liturgy in English reads so beautifully and simply, and that's what we need to appreciate and be aware of. So that was a special pleasure. Thank you all. This morning I want to say a little bit about, the theme is, what kind of person was Ephrem? What kind of guy was he? And most of what I have to say today, I learned from Professor Griffith. So I'll be watching the expression on his face to see how far I wander.
Not fair. And not true, Joe, you know that.
Too true, too true. We stand on the shoulders of giants. But before I started with Professor Griffith, he was away on leave, I think. But for some reason, we had other professors. They were very good. And that's where I became introduced. I started to get introduced to the literature that would eventually find a place in the life of Ephrem. And so we were all supposed to choose, each of us in the seminar was supposed to choose a series of texts in the same genre of Syriac and read them deeply and sort of come to some conclusions about them. Other people in the seminar at the time knew a whole lot more than I did. All I knew really was about hagiographic literature a little bit. So I got permission, it was begrudgingly granted, to do my seminar work on the literature that eventually contributed to the Tashlitho, to the classic life of Saint Ephrem the Syrian. I no sooner got into it than I realized maybe I had made a bad choice. Because I went to the professor and I said, you know, this is all pretty bad stuff. It consisted of 5th and 6th century monastic literature about Ephrem, and story after story had to do with the attempts of beautiful young women, some not so beautiful, some not so young, but for the most part beautiful young women who were intent on deflowering Ephrem. They saw his virtue as something, as a mountain that they wanted to climb. They were going to put Ephrem in his place. These were tasteless stories, lurid, and all the same. The professor told me I remember very clearly. He said, remember the era you're dealing with. Whenever Eve is the problem, men are always the hapless victims. But I said, they knew something about Ephrem and all of the fine things he had to say about women. Why didn't any of that make it into the literature? He said, and this is kind of the theme for today's talk, he said, people who feel the need to cut Ephrem down to size inevitably cut him down to their own size. So I went back to the work. Now I was as angry at Ephrem as I was at the monks. Because if he had been a little more forthcoming about his life and his background, said anything about his family, what went into his own education and upbringing, maybe he wouldn't have left the field open for anybody to say anything they felt like about him. So I got to work to ask the question of what kind of person Ephrem was might seem a little out of place, because he tells us what kind of person he is in different ways, and in a number of places he describes himself. At least he describes the kind of person he wants us to think he is. And some of these points regarding identity is what I'd like to talk a little bit about this morning. Identity is a complicated thing. It's personal, it's social, it's religious, it's ethnic, it's racial, it's national. All of those things go into identity. Ephrem, though, insists repeatedly on one point, and I know you know this, and now the clicker's gone.
No.
Oh, okay. Yes. He says, I'm a simple, uneducated man, a stranger to book learning. So that should pretty much sum it up. But like I tried to show a little bit last night, anybody who thinks and writes like Ephrem does isn't simple at all. He's very complicated. And I think he intended to be complicated. And just to step back a minute, I need to make a correction of something I said last night. I didn't mean to be nasty when I said what I said about Jacob of Saruf. But please keep in mind that Jacob himself said, Ephrem wrote in technicolor. I write in shades of gray. By the time Syriac literature gets around to Jacob's time, it's really beginning a decline. Jacob realizes it. He can still read Ephrem pretty well, handle that level of the language. But it's what Ephrem does is so far superior to what Jacob does, not just in form, but in thought. Jacob, if you recall last night, we had the X on the screen, the letter key for the word chiasm. Jacob does chiasm very well. What he doesn't know how to do anymore is how to connect the loops of the X so that it becomes an ongoing, eternal message. He knows the crossbars, but he's forgotten. Syriac has now started to distance itself from its roots in Judaism and in Scripture. It started to absorb Greek thought. In particular, thought that comes very close to what we see in people like Evagrius. It becomes mystical, thought-heavy, which is fine, but that's not Ephrem at all. That's the correction I want to make. Ephrem insists time and time again that he's a simple man, a simple, uneducated man. In what sounds like a prayer, he thanks God for making him simply an alono, a word that's difficult to translate, helper, steward. I've even seen one translation that calls him a shepherd boy. That's fine. It's a very strange, unused Syriac word, alono. It occurs twice in the whole Old Testament. But as soon as he calls himself an alono, he quickly reminds God that he sent the Lord to be our helper as an alono. Talk about chutzpah. Talk about chutzpah. Ephrem sees his ministry, in a way, as a continuation of the very thing our Lord was up to. Later tradition, of course, took the giant step of interpreting alono as deacon, which raises a whole new set of problems. It's strange, but maybe not so strange, that even when talking about deacons in the church, Ephrem doesn't include himself in the group. He never uses mshamshono about himself. The notion that Ephrem was a deacon was first circulated by St. Jerome, who heard about Ephrem third hand, maybe fourth hand. Jerome was in distant Bethlehem. He didn't know Ephrem, he didn't know Syriac, but he heard about Ephrem somehow, we don't know how, and he decided, well, Ephrem was diakonos. He might have been, but whatever Jerome meant by diakonos is not what we mean by deacon today. That's the only point I want to make. The notion stuck, though. After Jerome invented it, the notion stuck. Recall that Nicaea legislated that the bishop was the only official teacher in the diocese, but he could delegate sub-teachers. And among those sub-teachers, Nicaea talked about deacons. So that might begin to explain how this idea of Ephrem as a deacon began. But when and where did he become a deacon? History loves a vacuum. Everybody's got a story, and everybody contributed. Tradition filled in the blanks by saying, well, if he was in Nisbis all his life, Jacob, the bishop who he expresses such personal devotion for, Jacob must have ordained him a deacon. It's funny that with all of the beautiful things, really, that Ephrem has to say about Jacob, he never once mentions that. When you read Ephrem's remarks about Jacob, you get the idea that Ephrem sat in Jacob's catechism class as a little kid and absorbed what Jacob had to say, but Jacob wasn't around by the time Ephrem would have been old enough to become what we call a deacon. I think the model of Jacob for Ephrem was very specific. He says that Jacob spoke in balance and in rhythm. Those are the same two words he uses when he describes Bardaizan, but in a good way. He's saying Bardaizan introduced balance and rhythm. We would call it poetry. by the time the language becomes structured that way. Ephrem uses that same phrase to describe Jacob. Jacob had that same feel for letters that Ephrem would later have and outshine Jacob as. But what his remarks tell me is that he learned that, he was tuned into that by hearing Jacob's voice in Sunday school and in preaching. Jacob had that knack, that very Semitic knack for using words in ways that were unforgettable. He spoke with balance and rhythm. But nowhere does he say Jacob ordained him as a deacon. Another tradition, of course, insists, and this was the one that made it into the life of Ephrem, is that somehow, we'll talk about it, Basil of Caesarea ordained Ephrem to the diaconate. And a long and complicated story developed to explain how that happened. Basil had no knowledge that Ephrem existed, and Ephrem had no knowledge that Basil existed. But the life invents a very nice tale, a long tale, that sends Ephrem to meet Jacob. On the way, he makes a side trip to Egypt, where he is instructed in monastic philosophy. And he stays there 4 years, learning with the monks of Egypt how to be a good monk. Today, if you visit the monastery of Our Lady of the Syrians in the Nitrian desert, the monks will show you a tree in the courtyard that they insist Ephrem planted when he was there. And then the little souvenirs you can buy in the monastery's gift shop, they all depict Ephrem vested as a monk, but sitting under that tree. It's good for tourists, you know. From Egypt, he goes to Caesarea in Cappadocia because he prayed to God to give him some inkling of what kind of man Basil was. And he has a dream of a tornado of fire inside the sanctuary, and the voice tells him that fiery tornado is Basil. Go visit him. So Ephrem gets on another boat to travel from Egypt to Cappadocia. On the way, he does some nice biblical miracles. He raises a dead girl to life. He calms the sea. And he arrives in Caesarea, the tradition tells us, with a translator, because he doesn't know Greek. This is an important point. He takes a monk with him that's bilingual in Syriac and Greek so that he can speak to Basil. But the two show up in town and they have the appearance and the manner of country bumpkins. And the story wants us to see them that way. There's no room in the inn for them, so they have to sleep in a stable, conveniently. And finally, when they go to church the next day to see Basil in the flesh, Ephrem is so overcome by the grandeur and the elegance of Byzantine worship that he says to his monk buddy who's translating for him, he says, "We have to be in the wrong place. What saint would be surrounded by such lavish accoutrements?" But through a long series of events, Basil and Ephrem finally meet in the sacristy after Mass. To make a long story short. And Basil calls him the Anthony of Syria. O father of the desert, he says, you are Anthony of Syria. Anthony of Syria. Do you have anything in your heart that you've been asking God for, and he hasn't yet granted your prayer? Is there anything I can pray for on your behalf? Because I see you're a holy and good man. Before Ephrem has a chance to answer, Basil says, well, in one version of the story, he says, I want to ordain you a priest. And Ephrem goes through the ritual denials. Oh, I'm not worthy, I'm not worthy. But Basil says, kneel down anyway. Kneel down anyway. And I'll pray to God at least for you to receive the blessing of the thing that you've always wanted. And what is that thing you've always wanted? And Ephrem says to Basil, it's the desire of my life that before I die, God gives me the gift of speaking Greek. So Basil begins to recite the prayer of ordination to the diaconate. And when it comes time for the ministers to respond, Ephrem miraculously answers the prayer in Greek. Talk about prayers getting heard. The story then says that Basil responds by saying, in the day, he quotes the psalm that says, in the day of the Lord, the lame will leap like stags, and deaf mutes will come to life with an explosion of words. That line is in the original Greek version of the story, but it was too much for the Syrian monks to swallow. To call Ephrem a deaf mute before, they knew better. So they dutifully translated that story into Syriac, but they left out that line. So Ephrem received his fondest wish in the world. He was able to speak Greek. What's the point here? The point is that whatever Ephrem was in the church of his day, it's nothing we have an equivalent to now. In several places, Ephrem prays out loud that the work of his hands will be medicine of life for struggling faith. That too is a pretty lofty ambition, since medicine of life is his favorite term for Eucharist. We begin to get the feeling that this is not someone who's as simple and down to earth as we like to think he is. Ephrem admits that he has a tendency toward boldness. In 3 collections of Madroshe on paradise, on wayward teachings, and on fasting, he says, I wish I could learn to rein in my language, which always seems on the verge of getting him into trouble. He says, quote, what I have said here must satisfy my boldness. He has more on his mind, but he knows it's maybe not appropriate to talk about it. If this sounds like chutzpah, we're not very far from the truth. That's the very word Ephrem used to describe it. Except today, we pronounce it hesfo. Ephrem had a view of himself that encouraged hyperbole. It was all part of a calculated strategy to distance himself from the ecclesiastical culture of his day that had embraced top-heavy language. When he insisted that he was a simple man, he was making a statement about who he was, but just as importantly, who he was not. He was not one of those people. So as much as we'd like to take Ephrem's description of himself as a simple man at face value, the evidence points very much in the other direction. Ephrem, I like to think of Ephrem as the kind of person who could stare out the window for hours at a time and be perfectly happy about it. Everything he looked at and everywhere he looked, he saw complexity, not simplicity. He describes rolling a pearl in the palm of his hand, and whichever way he rolled it, he saw another face of Christ. He describes dissecting a dust mite. That's hard to even do under a microscope. But the parts of the dust mite took him into the mystery of divinity. Ephrem was able to see wonder in what is mundane and unremarkable. This process he summed up in one word. It was rozo. Rozo for Ephrem is not symbol. Rozo is a way of looking at life. Rozo takes you beyond what the intellect informs us about. Rozo is a thin coin. One side registers the world as we see it and take it in. The other side, the same coin, gives us the deeper meaning. Rozo is the deep truth embedded in the things we see and touch and hear. Without the intellect, we wouldn't have access to Rozo. So he appreciates the intellect for that. But the intellect does not give us the full picture. Ephrem shows a good bit of knowledge and appreciation for the science of his day, technology as it existed at that time. And he says, this is wonderful stuff that we can do. And he lists things. But that's not the whole picture. The intellect only takes us so far. So what did it mean to be simple in the 4th century? If he calls himself a simple man, what did that mean in the 4th century? It meant to be accessible. It meant to be concrete, not abstract. And it meant clarity. It meant, in other words, the very opposite of all of the academic jargon that obscured faith. He says, in I've taught Syriac for so long. He says, why should we be adding words to the truth that God dictated to us in Scripture when these words only justify our arrogance, show how smart we are? You don't add words to the Bible. Arrogance comes up a lot when Ephrem speaks, and it's never a good thing. He says in Madroshe on faith, this arrogant generation we live in today has invented a new faith for us to believe in. why, he asked, were the debates in the church so fierce and so destructive? His answer was even bolder. He saw the true nature of what was engulfing the church. Why had theological discourse sunk to such a low level? He says, these debates turn a profit. As more elite intellectuals were assuming leadership roles in the church, they were transforming Christianity into a religion for rulers. Philosophy and rhetoric, the cornerstone of Greek education, invited, almost demanded, hair-splitting and public debate. But what specifically was the profit in these debates? Well, the best way to attract the emperor's attention and to pave the way to advancement and reward was to beat the drum of orthodoxy by calling out heretics wherever you thought they were, even where they weren't sometimes. Heretics real or imagined. So when Ephrem calls himself a simple, uneducated man, this was not a declaration of meekness or humility. It was a declaration of independence. He was standing clear of this spirit. He was going to be a man of the people, and he was going to stay there. Calling himself a simple man was like laying down the gauntlet, setting out the boundary lines between himself, his church, and the hair-splitting madness that was going on all around him. Where did Ephrem fit in this complicated picture? Or to put it another way, how were people like Ephrem being viewed by those in the intellectual centers of the church, if they knew about him at all? It's an interesting question, I think. So, if we can bring up here we are. How was Ephrem and his people viewed? You don't need to hear me, you can read it. This is by Juvenal, the great Roman satirist Juvenal. You know the quotation. Syria's Orontes River has been disgorging its sludge into the Tiber for some time now. It has brought us the language and the customs of Syria. Female flute players, Eve. Female flute players, slanting harps, exotic tambourines, and young girls with instructions to loiter near the circus. Go to them if you have a taste for barbarian she-wolves dressed in gaudy headdresses. This is the Roman view of Syrians. It's not entirely foreign to today's Western perspective on refugees leaving Syria. It's hard to hear this ancient complaint without seeing what's going on today in Europe and the rest of the world. In so many cases, our modern reaction is not very far from the ancient ones. Syrians, according to Juvenal, were a danger to civil society. Cultured people didn't act that way. Syriac was heard on the streets of Rome. They bring their language and their customs. And it disgusted Romans. Romans, of course, conquered Greeks, and that's how they took possession of the Middle East. But they inherited from Greeks their sense of cultural superiority. They say that Romans conquered Greece, but Greeks conquered Romans with their love of culture, language, and high-mindedness. Greek-speaking Romans, like their Latin-speaking ancestors, didn't have much use for Syrians, their culture, or their language. If they had known about Ephrem, they wouldn't have thought about him very long. There wasn't much he could have told them. Of all the conquered peoples in the Roman Empire, Syrians rated lowest on the imperial scale. Libanius, the great orator of Antioch and master of Greek culture, Chrysostom studied under him, spoke of a certain member of the Roman Senate whom he despised. And he had this to say: "This man can't string together a simple Greek sentence. He's a bigger disgrace to Roman civility than all of those illiterate street peddlers who ply their trade in Syriac. Bowls mended, knives sharpened." We know the kind of people he's talking about. So lowlifes spoke Syriac, people without education, not professional people. Ecclesiastical historians like Palladius and Sodzaman, and even, I'm sorry to say, Theodoret of Syr, were all major contributors to what would emerge as the life of Ephrem. And they strained to make the point that if Ephrem had anything of value to say, it was through direct divine intervention. It was nothing he could have come to on his own. Sodzaman, in fact, offers this backhanded compliment to Ephrem, and I quote, "Although Ephrem was a stranger to learning," by which he meant Greek learning, "God endowed him with understanding that in some cases rivaled even Greeks," if you can believe it. Tradition gives Theodoret, the bishop of Syr, a central place in Ephrem's emerging reputation. True or false, though, he held an elitist view of native Syriac culture. It comes as something of a surprise that the Syriac life of Ephrem, in fact, is a compilation of Greek accounts, none of which originate in Syriac. These are stitched together and retro-translated into Syriac, and behold, we have the biography of Ephrem. But let's look at what, of course, Theodoret had no personal knowledge of Ephrem. He lived after Ephrem's time. But let's look at what he has to say. "A demon came to me during the night, pleading with me to release a man I imprisoned for heresy. But I immediately recognized that it was a demon, a stranger to the truth. He spoke to me in Syriac."
Hallelujah.
It is Theodoret, in fact, who opens his purported history of Ephrem with the words, "Hono mar Ephrem itawo begense suioyo." This Ephrem about whom I'm speaking is Syrian by race. He uses similar words to introduce his comments on Antony of Egypt and on other non-Syrians who he's trying to bring into the fold. But he begins his narrative always by pointing out to his Greek-educated audience that these people were not native like they were. They were by exception, by grace brought into the flock. Is there any validity to these attitudes? We need to ask in fairness. Or did they mask deeper fears? To put it another way, was orthodoxy, as these men conceived of it, a mask for privilege? For all their lofty views of Greek culture and their scorn for Syrians and their language, churchmen who did their theology in Greek were at a distinct disadvantage. The word they used for Greek, Hellenikos, was murky. It meant everything from Greek language and culture of their own day, but it also meant ancient Greek mythology and stories of the gods and unedifying narratives that children and old women like to repeat. And in their spare time, of course, the Greek gods carried on like spoiled adolescents. The only word they had to describe both contemporary culture and pagan Greek culture was Hellenikos. Even highly regarded scholars today, you will read, argue that Ephrem's distrust of Greek culture had to do with pagan Greek culture, not with contemporary Greek culture. But this position overlooks something that these people know very well, or should. Syriac had two very different words. For contemporary Greeks, there were Ionae, Ionians, literally. But they had an entirely different word for ancient pagan Greeks, Hanphe. It's interesting, the Arabic cognate, Hanif, means just the opposite. It means a true monotheist. They were Hanphe. Ephrem took evident delight in pointing out that Christians who spoke in Syriac didn't labor under the ambiguities that the Greeks had inherited. When Ephrem said he wrote against the bitter poison of the wisdom of the Greeks, he said the bitter poison of the wisdom of the Eunoie, not the Hanphe. He knew how Greeks thought of him and his culture and his language. The Greeks were in charge and had been from day one. And Syrians always got the short end of the deal. If modern interpreters find it necessary to gloss Ephrem's words in order to make him one of their own, Ephrem himself had a very different idea. Culture and power went hand in hand, and language expressed both of them. So what were Ephrem's thoughts about power? Specifically Roman power, because although we think of them as Greek Byzantines, he knew, and people in Western Asia knew very well, that these were Romans who spoke Greek. Ephrem took the idea of empire for granted. It's all he ever knew. It's all anybody in that part of the world knew for centuries. One day it was Assyria, the next day it was Babylonia, the next day it was Persia, the next day it was Greece. After that it was Rome. The idea of living without empire was unthinkable. You couldn't separate those who were in charge from their culture. because they came with you at it from on top. Culture was both dominating and domineering, especially to Syrians. As far as Ephrem was concerned, empire wasn't good or bad. It was just a fact of life. Life was unthinkable without someone ruling over you. You had to serve somebody. Rome, as I said, inherited its sense of superiority from the Greeks. Empire, as Ephrem saw it, implied a division of labor, and this was it. Emperors enforced the peace. Without peace, there's no life. There's no business. Civil society can't go on without peace. Clergy, priests and bishops, pray for the emperor that he keep the peace. Why? Because emperors were autocrats. They could do anything they wanted, anytime, and they did. So the best a Christian could do was to pray that the emperor would act like an adult, that he would keep the peace, so that people could live their lives. And then came Julian. That deserves a drink. How am I doing time-wise?
You're good. You're good.
I think we started late.
We'll finish late, don't worry.
Don't worry. Julian the Apostate. He was the emperor that disowned Christianity and had in mind to return the empire to paganism. But Julian represented an evil of a very personal kind to Ephrem. I mean, all of Christians at this time in the world spoke against Julian. But he represented something up close to Ephrem. Julian shuttered the church in Nisbis. He closed it down. He replaced it with a temple to the Syrian goddess. Well, the Greeks called her Astarte, but we called her Asherah. She's talked about in the Old Testament. Greek governors of Palestine tried to introduce her worship among the Jews. Julian found the practice of Christian sexual renunciation onerous in the extreme. He couldn't see how rational people would deny such a basic thing about themselves. The historian Ammianus Marcellinus tells us that the church in Nisbis had a reputation throughout Syria for its consecrated virgins, the B'nai B'net Kiomo. But the temple Julian personally had built in downtown Nisbis after he closed the church was intended as a direct counterforce to the B'nai Kiomo. And by all appearances, it was a success. The worship of Astarte involved public displays of debauchery and sex. Ephrem admits to his horror that with the church closed, the B'nai and the B'nat Kiomo went downtown to church. They attended these rites. After all, in a way, in their defense, it was a little bit, if they hadn't, it was a little bit like not standing up for the Pledge of Allegiance. This was the emperor's building. It was the emperor's way of worship. And if you're part of the empire, you follow the worship of the emperor. As revolting as Ephrem found this, he was even more outraged by Julian's overtures toward Judaism. Although there's no indication that rational Jews ever wanted to have any part of Ephrem, any part of Julian, he announced plans to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. And of course, this was outrageous to any believing Christian. A rebuilt temple, in its own way, denied everything Christ stood for and everything they believed in. But as much as Ephrem railed against Julian, and this is important, we need to remember that he only cursed him. He called him Haurashi'o, that miscreant. He only published his hymns on Julian after Julian was safe in the grave. Ephrem was no fool. He knew what he could say and when he could say it. The people of Amid, just north of Nisbis, were butchered by Malkei Mhaimne, believing emperors. They were butchered for believing emperors for sheltering Persian troops as they withdrew from a battle with the Romans, as if the people of Amid would have had a choice in the matter. So being a Christian emperor wasn't an automatic guarantee of anything either. You have to read Ephrem closely, but here and there he does show his hand. When Nisbis was under one of its many attacks from the east by Persia, and all the Roman king's horses and all the Roman king's men were nowhere to be found, Ephrem published, "God saved us without a king." How did he get by with this? Well, of course, he said it in Syriac. You could say what you wanted in Syriac. It's like using ghetto English. It's an internal code that only you and your people understand. If word had gotten out that Ephrem was talking this way about the emperor, these words would have been taken as treasonous. In the end, we have to recall that it wasn't Julian who did damage, lasting damage. Of all things, it was Malcolm Haimno, a believing emperor. It's another one of those phrases Ephrem never used, but always comes up in the literature attributed to him. It was a believing emperor who betrayed Nisbis, who required that the Christians leave the city and hand everything over to the Persians. Even to believing emperors, Nisbis had become a political liability, an inconvenience. That wouldn't have been the case if it was in Greek-speaking territory. Ephrem here spoke his mind. What could prepare a person for this disgrace? The city that served as the head of the Roman defenses in the east has been reduced to the hind end of Persia. You get the image. In the year 637, the Emperor Heraclius, mounted on horseback in the hills over Antioch, looked down on the Arab Muslim legions as they streamed into the city, and he said, "Farewell, O dear Syria, farewell, beautiful province. You belong to infidels now. Peace be with you, sweet Syria. You were beautiful for as long as we knew you." The West has been retreating from the East ever since. Just a quick wrap up. Jews were in a better position to understand the workings of empire, especially the Roman Empire, which of course had destroyed their city and sent them packing more than once. They were especially, of course, understanding of Constantine and his relatives for making the heretical sect of Christians the religion of the empire. Ephrem might have been deeply wounded and betrayed by what Jovian did to Syria, but the Jews weren't. Next slide, please. 3 ribs were in his mouth between his teeth, quoting the book of Daniel. Rabbi Yohanan said, this refers to Helzon, Adiabene, and Nisbis, which Rome sometimes swallows and sometimes spits out. So Rome was like any imperial government. It did what was best for Rome. Early in his Madroshe on faith, Ephrem crafts a sequence of 40 consecutive verses that combine biblical metaphors and his own teaching. I want to skip here. He wants us to know that he is a scribe working toward the kingdom of God. Can we see this? The next slide. Quickly, blessed is the one who has set up a clear mirror of truth and has seen your birth reflected in it, a birth greater than all tongues. Blessed is the one who has become the salt of truth in this generation. This is the same generation he called arrogant for inventing a new faith, whose faith is not the generation that has not lost its taste among the tasteless who investigate you. Blessed is the one whose harp plays songs played by David, and so on and so on. I know you're familiar with it. The question is, who's he talking about? He's talking about people who hear and make sense of his message and who resonate with it, but he's also talking about himself. He is blessed, along with those who work with him and understand his work. In each stanza, Ephrem makes what he teaches, his approach to God, and what he's known for, the measure of blessedness. Ephrem is the model of correctness. He enjoins his characteristics on those of his audience. Here, too, he wants to evoke the scriptures. This whole series in Syriac, Tubal, 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 is intended to resonate with the Beatitudes. Let my teaching be like the medicine of life. The hagiographic tradition, as I've been trying to point out, picks up on this and uses it to its own advantage. Look what it says. I love the Syriac. It says it so much better. Vole aloho menkres eme, ach aramoyon vio, the nanhar lakule tibel men semhai malfonute. God chose him from his mother's womb, just like Jeremiah, to light up the whole world with the rays of his teaching. The hagiographic tradition remembered him this way, and his own writing seems to put him in line with biblical authors. Did he think of himself as a continuation of Scripture? Our gathering here, which I'm very grateful to be a part of, is an expression. We are one facet, at least, of this legacy that Ephrem leaves us. The legacy is not always clear. I once said to someone, what we have in the various Syriac traditions today are like dots that aren't always easy to connect. And this person knew better than I did. She said, in some cases, we don't even have the dots. But Ephrem left signposts along the way, valuable and helpful ones. Sometimes they contradict each other. It is good and even necessary to explore and find meaning in what we can from the past. But we need to remind ourselves that, and this gets back to how we closed last night's discussion, to remind ourselves that we are walking on holy ground. Ephrem comes from a very different time and place than ours. He's not an early version of ourselves. He's not one of us. He's nothing like us. In our efforts to understand him, we need to be alert to the default and problematic position common to intellectual tradition. We've seen some of the attitudes in which the religious preferences of Greco-Roman elites become normative. We take them for granted, uncritically accepting them. As we have seen here, they were not nearly as accommodating to Ephrem's worldview as Catholicizing views, and I use the word both with capital C and small c, as Catholicizing views want to suggest. The tendency toward accommodation needs to be vigorously challenged, especially when we're dealing with someone as creatively complex and intentionally ambiguous as Ephrem can be. If it is not, we contribute to a deeply flawed and distorted account of the past, which reinforces our own prejudices and reassures us of our own rightness. This is why we need to take extreme caution, not simply that we do not cut Ephrem down to size, but that we don't cut him down to our size. You've been very kind. Thank you.
Father Joe, thank you. These have been really wonderful opportunities for us. I'm wondering if you'll continue to take some questions as you did last night.
If there's time.
I'm hoping yes.
I don't want
Mr.
to-
Peters, yeah.
I know people have to travel, so.
But we have lunch at
lunch up.
Oh, that's
we have
right.
lunch at 12. So
We don't want them to travel hungry, no.
Okay, so after listening to everything, we know St. Ephrem was in the 4th century, and all the scriptures was written in Greek. And he spent
Well,
no.
be careful, the attitudes of Western intellectuals.
Okay, maybe. And then
Ephrem didn't know the 4 Gospels. Ephrem knew the Thessalonian Syriac.
Okay, she spent 4 years philosophy in Egypt, influenced by Greek culture. No.
Well, but that's the story. But of course, he never left Syria.
Okay, so I'm just trying to understand if he spent all these places.
Yeah. But what I was trying to say was, these are all mythical trips he took.
Oh, okay.
He never went anywhere. He he went to the grocery store, stuff like that. But he never made international trips.
So Father Joe, just to follow up on this, he was not a monk. He was not a deacon.
Well, not in the sense that we understand that.
Okay. So I just want to keep going a little farther.
What about-
Perhaps he was. Huh?
What about the ordination? He said he was right.
That's all Chabriyet. That's all the stories. That's all part of the stories. Perhaps he was or was not a Benai Kiyama. We don't know if he was. We do know that he served the sick and the poor. I think, or is that part of hagiography?
That's
So we want to know what his stated life was.
if we accept the idea that he traveled to Odessa at the end of his life, and there's no proof for it. He never even mentions that he made the trip. And when you realize how deeply he had affection for his native Nisbis, you'd think if he evacuated the city with all the Christians, he would have said something about it. It's at that point that the Edessan monks then continue to attribute his holiness to the holiness of Basil. Basil is the one who set up infirmaries all over his diocese to take care of the sick and the infirm. So at the end of his life, the Edessan monks say Ephrem did the same thing. He set up a Xenodikaion, an infirmary for sick people. Now, he might have done it, but there's no evidence at all that he dabbled in that kind of stuff. I don't think he was the kind of person who could carry through that kind of project. He didn't have the mind for that sort of practical business.
So another follow-up. So perhaps he was just a good layman of his church that had a passion for Christ and loved the scriptures, memorized it. He could quote it and easily make the
loop.
Always the loop back to the
Yeah.
to paradise, which is the person of Christ fulfilling that.
The only thing I take exception to, Bishop,
Okay.
is the word just.
Okay.
He was just the person who. What else is there
Okay.
than to take the scriptures to heart? And he had them memorized. He had parts of the Bible memorized that we don't even know exist. I mean, that we just pass over. And he sees in those parts reflections of what's going on in his own world. Tony?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned, I wanted to take up what I asked last night about his use of the Bible, and would you speak a little bit about his use, because unless I'm wrong, his knowledge of the New Testament was a diatessaron, was it not, or?
It seems like that. It seems like that. And in other extra biblical, for instance, what we take to be non-canonical, like the infancy narratives,
Yeah.
those come up all through his writing, especially with regard to the Virgin Mary. He had the same attitude toward those writings as Judaism did. The calling some writings canonical and other writings extra-canonical is a very modern notion. These were edifying stories, part of popular culture. Most of them, except for things like the infancy narratives, inherited from Jewish Aramaic society. They just didn't make the kinds of but he knew them by heart and knew how and where to exploit them to his own good.